The rusted iron gate groaned, a long, piercing shriek that died instantly in the thick gray fog. Elias pushed, his shoulders straining against the weight until the courtyard of Blackwood Asylum opened before him. He did not hesitate. He stepped over a pile of rotted medical ledgers, the paper damp and pulpy under his boots. His flashlight beam cut a sharp white path through the stagnant air, illuminating the monolith of stone ahead. It loomed like a tomb, silent and absolute. He checked his watch. Midnight. He was here to document the site. But the air felt heavy, pressing against his eardrums like deep water. He reached the main entrance and shoved the heavy doors inward. Inside, the main hall stretched out, cold and cavernous. Rows of rusted iron beds stood in the dark, their frames twisted and skeletal, resembling the remains of something long forgotten. He stopped, holding his breath, listening for any sign of life. There was none. The silence was not empty. It was deliberate, waiting. A metallic clatter erupted from the floor above, sharp and violent, shattering the heavy silence. Elias froze. His pulse hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the settling of the building. He waited, eyes locked on the ceiling. The silence returned, but it had changed. It felt predatory now. He gripped his camera, knuckles white, the strap biting into his wrist. He turned toward the grand staircase, the wood groaning under his weight as he began the ascent. Each step was a deliberate, agonizing test. He reached the landing, the air growing colder, smelling of dust and wet stone. He paused, his breath hitching in his chest. He reached the second floor, then the third, his flashlight beam trembling as it swept across the peeling walls. Every shadow seemed to recoil. He stood at the top of the stairs, ears straining, his heart thudding so hard he could feel it in his throat. He took a step forward, the floorboards screaming. He moved toward the dark corridor, his senses sharpened to a razor edge. The third-floor hallway was a tunnel of peeling paint and shadows. Elias moved slowly, his flashlight beam sweeping over doors. He stopped before a heavy oak door, left slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness within. He pushed it open. The wood groaned, a long, mournful sound that seemed to vibrate through the floor. He stepped inside. The room was sparse, dominated by a single chair placed dead center, facing a wall that defied logic. Thousands of tally marks were scratched into the stone, layer upon layer, creating a jagged, chaotic texture. Elias stepped closer, his boots crunching on debris. The air here was different, heavy with the scent of damp earth and metallic blood. On the floor lay a leather-bound journal. Its cover was warped, the pages swollen and dark with moisture. He gripped the journal, ready to open it, unaware that the room was watching him. Elias reached for the journal, his fingertips just inches from the damp leather, when the door behind him slammed shut with a deafening thud. The blast of air extinguished his flashlight for a heartbeat before it flickered back to life. He lunged for the handle, his palms sliding against the cold, unyielding iron. He pulled, then kicked, his shoulder slamming into the wood with enough force to jar his teeth, but the lock held firm. It was as if the door had fused with the stone frame. He stopped, chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps as he pressed his ear against the grain. Silence greeted him, thick and suffocating. Then, from the absolute darkness of the corners behind him, a sound emerged. It was slow, rhythmic, and deliberate, the harsh scrape of heavy chains dragging across uneven stone. Each link rattled against the floorboards, a metallic rasp that seemed to vibrate through the soles of his boots. He spun around, his light cutting through the gloom, but the beam only revealed the empty chair and the wall of tally marks. The dragging continued, closer now, shifting from the left to the right. Elias fumbled for his radio, his thumb clicking the channel dial, but only static hissed back, a harsh, distorted sound that filled the room. He turned his flashlight toward the corner where the dragging noise had originated. A figure stood in the gloom, its head tilted at an impossible, unnatural angle. It did not move, yet the air around it seemed to warp and ripple. The figure took a single jerky step forward, its feet scraping against the stone floor. Elias backed away until his shoulders pressed hard against the locked door, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The figure raised a hand, its fingers long and gaunt, and pointed directly at the wall of tally marks. Elias followed the gesture with his light. There, at the very end of the long, jagged row, was a mark that stood out from the rest. It was wet. A thick, dark, crimson liquid pooled at the base of the scratch and began to drip, sliding slowly down the stone surface. The entity was not a ghost of the past. It was a predator, and it had just updated its count. The room felt suddenly smaller. The figure moved with a sickening, fluid grace, closing the distance until it stood inches from him. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over bone, and its eyes remained fixed on the camera held in Elias's trembling hands. It reached out, fingers cold as ice, and brushed the lens. The device shuddered in his grip, the screen flickering violently. Static washed over the display, then sharpened into a grainy, high-contrast feed of the room. Elias stared at the screen, his breath hitching in his throat. The room on the monitor was not empty. It was packed. Dozens of figures stood in the corners, against the walls, and directly behind him, all perfectly still, their faces turned toward his position. He looked up from the camera, but the space in front of him remained vacant to the naked eye. He looked back down at the screen. The figures were closer now, their forms overlapping, a suffocating tide of shadows filling every available inch of the chamber. He dropped the camera, the plastic casing cracking against the floor, but the screen stayed lit. He was not alone in the room. He had never been alone. The tide of shadows surged forward, their movements synchronized and silent. Elias scrambled backward, his heels catching on the uneven floorboards. He spotted a loose metal bar protruding from the wall and wrenched it free, swinging it in a wild, desperate arc at the nearest figure. The metal whistled through the air, but it met no resistance. It passed through the form like smoke, meeting only the cold, stagnant air on the other side. He swung again, harder, his knuckles straining, but the bar hit nothing but empty space. The figures did not flinch, they simply drifted closer, their presence a suffocating weight that pressed against his chest. His headlamp flickered, the beam stuttering against the encroaching darkness. He tapped the side of the casing, but the light gave one final, dying pulse and vanished. Absolute darkness swallowed the room. He stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs, unable to see the threat closing in. Then, the silence was shattered by a sharp, metallic snap. The heavy iron lock on the door clicked open. Elias did not hesitate. He lunged toward the sound, his hands outstretched, desperate to escape. Elias lunged into the hallway, his boots thundering against the stone floor. He turned the corner, expecting the stairwell, but the path ahead was gone. Where the corridor should have stretched toward the exit, there was only a seamless, unbroken wall of cold stone. He spun around, frantic, and sprinted in the opposite direction, but the hallway had twisted. Every door he had passed moments before had vanished, replaced by smooth, featureless masonry that seemed to pulse in the dim light. He ran until his lungs burned, his footsteps echoing in a rhythm that felt wrong, too repetitive, too familiar. He rounded one final corner, his breath coming in ragged gasps, and skidded to a halt. He was back. The heavy oak door stood open before him, leading directly into the room with the chair. Elias stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving with every ragged breath. The silence here was different now. It was heavy, expectant, and absolute. He turned his gaze toward the wall, covered in frantic, scratched tally marks. There, amidst the centuries of desperate counting, a new mark had appeared. It was a long, vertical scratch, raw and fresh, glowing faintly against the ancient stone. It was a tally for one. The realization settled into his marrow, colder than the damp air of the asylum. There was no escape, no hidden passage, and no way to reverse the path he had taken. The asylum had not been empty when he arrived. It had been waiting. He walked toward the chair, his movements stiff and mechanical. The wood groaned as he lowered himself into the seat, the cold seeping through his skin and into his bones. He watched the door. It began to swing shut, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that defied the laws of physics. He did not reach out to stop it. He did not call for help. He simply watched as the gap of light narrowed, turning from a wide beam into a sliver, then a thin, sharp line. The heavy iron lock clicked into place with a final, echoing thud. The darkness was total, and the history of the asylum had gained its newest, permanent guest.